Good evening, everybody. It's your favorite maritime historian here with another episode of Historian Reacts. Today, we're going to be doing episode 3 of the Titanic miniseries. I did episodes 1 and 2 last night, and I'll link those videos in the description down below. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it here.
And what about the others? I must have the leader.
I hate it when this thing loads like that. It just does that sometimes. Okay.
Yes, Peter Piatkov. Peter the Painter. Policeman killer-in-chief. Where is he?
So, Peter Piatkov, also known as Peter Lumboff, was a Latvian immigrant to the UK during this time. He was the leader of a gang, and he was very, as they're saying, he had a fondness for killing policemen. There is some debate about whether or not he existed at all. And I think the idea of including him in this miniseries and having him be on the Titanic is very good historical fiction writing because it definitely does a good job of explaining what may have happened to him if he did exist, or because actually what is recorded is that about the same time of Titanic, Peter the Painter actually did disappear. So even though there is a debate about whether or not he actually existed, I think it's actually very, very good historical fiction writing that they're including him in this story. So the guy on the left here this is a younger Winston Churchill. At this time, he is rising through the ranks. He'll become First Lord of the Admiralty in about 3 years' time during the First World War. He is a son of politicians and a family of politicians. So to see him here in this is not surprising, and it's a great nod to history, and I love it. I always love seeing Churchill in films, no matter when it is set, and it's just a privilege to say. So I really do appreciate that. Points to Julian Fellows for that.
40,000 eggs?
Yes, sir.
3,500 onions?
Yes, sir.
So it's much like equipping a ship for a Caribbean cruise today. The amount of food that an ocean liner would go through is exceptional. Titanic, even though she was only 2/3 full, she still had over 2,000 passengers. She had capacity for 3,000 passengers and 1,000 crew, so about 4,000 people in total. It is simply extraordinary that even back then, this is 1912, without any of the modern systems in place to help with this level of logistics, that they were actually able to equip these liners efficiently and on time.
What's the difficulty? I have a brother, sir. I'm leaving the ship.
So, Fifth Officer Lowe, who you saw arguing with Sandrini here, he is probably the most hot-tempered of the officers. He was known to display that temper during the U.S. inquiry as well. And during the evacuation of Titanic, Lowe actually turned around and snapped at multiple people, including Ismay. Ismay was screaming at him to lower away, lower away, lower away. And Lowe turned around and snapped at him to something of the effect, shut up, basically. I'm working here. So, not very polite, but I'm not going to hold it against the guy for that. And I don't really mind it. But it just shows that Lowe, even though he's an officer and he's supposed to be a gentleman, so to speak, and he is, more or less, he is very hot-tempered. Not like to the point of like being violent. He's just got uh, a more shorter fuse compared to the rest of them. Which again, it's not a bad thing. I'm just saying that it's there.
On this ship, they prefer the boilers to be understaffed in the first-class dining room.
The mindset of that is accurate even today to an extent. It's not something that actually happens, of course, but the whole thing about cruise ships as well as ocean liners being more catering to passengers than to the handling of the actual ship is correct. It's absolutely correct.
Who's he, do you think? Looks like the wandering prophet.
If only you knew, Lightoller. And again, look at that scale. Look at that scale. That's absolutely perfect.
Peter Lobov. Take the next gangway. This is the second class.
Excellent historical tie-in using that name. It's perfect. Oops. Nice. Nice tie into the first episode there. That's what I love about this series. It does so well at that.
Benedicat vos omnipotent Deus, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
So, as was stated before in the first episode, the family here is Catholic and Maloney, and they're attending a Catholic service here on the ship. There were quite a few different denominations that were present on Titanic: Anglican, Catholic, uh, Presbyterian, Baptist. There were quite a few different religions that were present there. Jewish. I don't believe that there was a Jewish synagogue on Titanic. Queen Mary had one. Queen Mary was actually the first vessel that did, as far as I know, and that was 20 odd years later, about 25 years later, in 1936. So it wasn't there, but then again, most of the people who were immigrating to the United States were Christian on some level, whatever denomination they were, whether it was Catholic or Anglican or Presbyterian or Baptist or Christian Scientist. Lightoller was Christian Scientist. It varied considerably, and uh, for the Irish folk like here that's being shown here that are immigrating to America, most of them were Catholic.
Think I might stretch my legs up on deck.
Not me, I'm off for another dose of religion. Anglican this time.
Why?
Because in first class. I'm curious, aren't you?
I wired this ship, remember? I know every nook and cranny. But don't let me...
Indeed, that what we saw in the pretty much one of the opening scenes of the first episode where Maloney is up on his ladder and he's putting the wires in, that was actually in first class. You could tell that just by the quality of the carvings in the woodwork. So, he's definitely correct. The electricians who worked for Harlan and Wolff, they would have definitely have known quite a fair bit of the ship. I don't know if they would have necessarily known every nook and cranny, but it definitely speaks to the knowledge, intimate knowledge that these guys had. And this knowledge really came in handy, and this is why on maiden voyages such as this one, Harlan and Wolff would send a team of their experts from each of their fields, whether that was electrical or mechanical or navigational or whatever it was, they would send a group of these men along, and they're called the Guarantee Group. Maloney may or may not be a represented member of this, but it's definitely speaks to the ability of these workers who go on these maiden voyages. None of the 8 members of the Guarantee Group on Titanic survived. None of them survived. Andrews was the head of that group. There were an additional 7, a couple of electricians, a handful of engineers, to make certain that Titanic's power plant ran smoothly. That was really the biggest concern on maiden voyages, was the ability of the ship to maintain headway. It's a brand new power plant, okay? It's a brand new steam plant, and it's utilizing tried and true technology for the most part in the reciprocating engines, but the center turbine is a relatively new technology. Titanic is one of a handful of ships in the North Atlantic to get this installed first. The Lusitania class were the first vessels to go to all turbines, so no more reciprocating. Lusitania and Mauretania in 1906 and 1907, so only a couple years prior to Titanic, were the first 2 commercial passenger vessels to incorporate an all steam turbine plant. So this is still relatively new technology, and it was very important that everything ran smoothly, of course, and if anything was going to break down, it would likely be the engines. And this is actually talked about in the testimony after the disaster in the U.S. inquiry, where those who were defending Captain Smith, more or less, and coming after Ismay a little bit, were talking about this. And they were talking about how Smith didn't want to increase speed any more than necessary. He was talking about avoiding pushing the engines before they're properly broken in. It's no different than, say, like when you have a car that's fresh off the factory line, you don't want to push it too hard right out of the gate. You want to get things moving, get the parts moving, get the lubrication flowing through all the different parts and everything like that before you actually really put it into high gear. It's the same thing with ships. It's just on a much bigger scale. And that's why Titanic did not start off at going 22, 23 knots, but she gradually worked her way up to it. She started, once she left Southampton, she was going at about 19 to 20 knots over to Cherbourg. It's such a short hop from Southampton to Cherbourg. It's only about 200 miles. So she didn't really have to put it into high gear at that point, and then over to Queenstown, basically the same thing. In fact, on the journey from Cherbourg to Queenstown, nowadays known as Koba, Captain Smith actually did some maneuvering tests with the ship, and I think there's 2 reasons for this. One, they had just avoided a very nasty collision in Southampton. When Titanic departed Southampton, the other vessels which were tied up around her due to the coal strike, in fact, they had given up their coal to fill Titanic's bunkers. One of them, this SS City of New York, ended up being pulled from her moorings. The lines connecting her to another liner, Oceanic, snapped, and then she got drawn in toward Titanic because Titanic is so big. The suction that she generates from her movement through the water is so great that that's what happened. And if you watch videos of big cruise ships leaving port today, you can actually see that in action as the water recedes back several feet as the ship and then as the ship passes, it comes back again. It's the same thing. But this was still a relatively new concept in 1912 because they had not had ships this big before. So this is really a learning curve for them. So with this incident going through Captain Smith's mind, no doubt he probably had some pretty unpleasant flashbacks to Olympic, but give him credit where credit's due. He must have obviously thought a lot about what happened with Olympic and Hawk and figured out, okay, what can I do to prevent this from happening again? And that answer, of course, was a backwash on the port engine. He increased the speed on the port engine, and what that did is that created a flush of water out from the propeller, and that flush of water acted as a buffer, and that buffer kept New York from hitting Titanic. But even so, it was very close. But close is still okay. As long as you don't hit, it's okay. Technically, that's more or less the rule. The second thing that was likely going through Captain Smith's mind as well is that he was not actually present for Titanic sea trials. This is something that I think a lot of people forget. Captain Smith at the time was on Olympic. Okay, so remember, it's the 1st of April when Titanic goes out and has its 2nd of April when Titanic goes out and has its sea trials. Captain Smith is taking Olympic on a voyage from New York to Southampton. So he's not there when Titanic has her sea trials. Instead, it's Olympic's future captain, Captain Haddock, who has Titanic out for the sea trials. And then he gives a report back to the company and Captain Smith. But as most of us who understand the maritime environment know, a report like that, well, somewhat helpful, really doesn't convey a whole lot. It really can't, because in order to understand a ship on its sea trials, you really have to be there. The information that you'll get is all well and good, but it doesn't have the substance that it really needs. So Captain Smith is doing these zigzags, these turns, to get a feel for how his new ship actually handles. And he's going to take the opportunity to do this between Cherbourg and Queenstown, because he knows that once he gets out into the North Atlantic, he's pretty much on a time crunch, and he can't do that. But while he's close to Europe, he can.
Well, your adventure.
That's it. I'm always ready for a new adventure.
What did he want?
He's saying he's going up to the Anglican service. Although he doesn't strike me as a churchgoer.
People are full of surprises.
Says he wants to take a look.
I might go too.
What for?
It's a chance to see first class.
The Lord will smite you.
I don't think God will damn me for a little curiosity.
Turns out to be the God of the Old Testament.
I'll have to risk it.
You're going to dress her ladyship for dinner, and then... and then while they're eating, we'll go down to the hold, we'll fetch the bally thing, and you can put it in with the other jewels when you take the case back to the person.
She'll wonder why I've got the case out at all. I normally only bring what she's going to wear in a jewellery box.
I love the relationship between these two as well. Once again, just like with Annie and Sandrini, Apollo, we had the same situation here with Mr. Barnes and Watson as well. Here we go.
What did you see? Thank you. Iceberg, right ahead.
So they got the shape right, more or less. The shape of the iceberg is kind of up for debate somewhat, but just a day after Titanic sank, another vessel passed through the same area, and one of the passengers noticed that one of the icebergs looked a little funny. It had a streak of paint, red paint, along its side, indicating that it had been struck. So that was almost certainly the iceberg that sank the Titanic, and its shape was pretty much like a triangle, as you see depicted here. So that's more or less correct. Although we'll never know for sure what the exact shape was. I personally like Cameron's version of it the best, but this works as well. The height of it looks accurate based upon the reports from surviving crew members, especially the lookouts. They said that the height of the iceberg well exceeded that of the deck. So we're talking at least 60 feet, if not more. Some reports have it even as high as 100 feet. So more or less it's accurate, but it's one of those things that's up for debate, and we'll never know for sure, but we can make pretty good guesses based upon eyewitness accounts and, of course, the testimony of the passengers of that vessel that passed by the area the next day. Okay, so Murdoch, he's looking at this iceberg. He thinks for about 3 to 4 seconds, and then he makes his decision. That makes perfect sense, and that's more or less accurate as well. If you're a shipping captain, or he's first officer. He was originally chief officer, so he's pretty much on the command track with White Star at this point. And maybe another year or two, and he would have been a captain himself. So he's thinking about this. It takes him a couple seconds to process what he's seeing, and then to decide, what am I going to do? And I know Murdoch gets a bad rap a lot, but I don't entirely believe that's justified, because Murdoch did what any competent seaman would do. He was not going to turn into the berg. He wasn't going to order hard to port. And before we go any further, I should probably explain this a little bit, because it might seem confusing to some of us, because the berg's on the starboard side, so you would think that turning the boat to port would turn the ship away from the berg, and that would be true. But at this time, on British ships, the orders for port and starboard were for the rudder, not for the direction the ship was going to turn. Ships steer from the back, which means that whatever direction the rudder turns, the bow is going to go the opposite direction. So when he says hard to starboard, he's saying turn the rudder to starboard, and therefore the bow will swing to port out of danger, which makes perfect sense. You're not going to deliberately turn into danger. That would have been an incredibly incompetent thing to do. I know it doesn't seem like it nowadays, but hindsight is, as always, 2020, and it's very easy for armchair captains to put the blame on Murdoch for this, and I don't believe that's fair. He did exactly what he was trained to do, and you can never fault someone for that, nor should you ever. Okay, so that's more or less accurate, and that's based upon the testimony of the surviving fireman, namely Barrett. And the sound of the hull hitting the ice, and then you kind of see that wall bend in a little bit before those rivets come out. And that's exactly what happened. It wasn't that the steel plates themselves gave way, it's a handful of rivets. It was not a just giant 300-foot gash. It was a couple of seams along the side that could not take the pressure. And we're talking about pressure that's the equivalent to 40,000 pounds per square inch. That is a lot of pressure. Even ships today, modern icebreakers that are designed to go through ice, 40,000 pounds is a lot. Some of them can't even take that. And those are modern icebreakers. They can't take that. Some of them can, but a lot of them can't. Titanic is not even designed for this. So the fact that as little of her hull gave way as it did is actually very impressive. The amount of surface area that was actually opened up to the sea, the amount of hull, the rivets that actually gave way, we believe actually was only about 6 square feet. Which is like, if you have a box that's about this big by this big, the amount of the surface area that gave way would be no wider than this sheet of paper. Just this thin. Just this width right here on the edge. That's it. So Titanic gets a bad rep a lot for her hull giving way, and it really didn't. It was a handful of rivets that did. It had nothing to do with the cold water or anything being brittle or anything like that. I mean, that's just a theory that's destroyed by common sense. Titanic was built the same way that hundreds of other ships were and had been built and continued to be built well into the 1940s and 1950s. Welding didn't really become a major thing until about the 1950s, 1960s. So you got to think about that. So these vessels are all plying the same route, and none of them have these issues that the theory likes to think. If their hulls were brittle, shipping would have basically stopped because ships would be sinking every time they went out, basically. That is not the case here with Titanic. Titanic is exceptionally well built. Her steel plates are 2 inches thick. Now, is it the same quality steel nowadays? No. But it compensates for that by being so thick. And the strength of the steel hull that she had is about the equivalent of a modern vessels overall. The steel may not have been a better quality than it is today, but the thickness makes up the difference of that. Most of the difference of that anyway. And it was just a handful of rivets whose heads just could not take that impact and gave way. There are some who think that what Titanic actually hit was the ice ledge. It's also known as an ice ram, and it forms when an iceberg, after it flips over, because its previous bottom side, now on the top, had been melted by the water, where the top that's now on the bottom had not, and you get this ledge that forms near just below the waterline on the iceberg, where the previous top part of the berg has yet to really start melting away. And that makes perfect sense. I think that that's absolutely plausible. We'll never know for sure, but based upon the known picture of the berg in question, that does seem to be accurate. And you can kind of see, it's very hard to see, but in that picture you can kind of see the what looks like a ledge, and I'll link that picture down in the description below as well. That height of that bird looks more or less accurate. That's accurate. It's actually a little bit excessive. The shaking in the first class smoking room would not have been that severe. At most, you would have had, if you had a drink, like a glass of wine or something like that, sitting on the table there, it would ripple a little bit. The wine in the glass would ripple a little bit, but it wouldn't slosh. That shaking is strong enough to make a glass of wine slosh, and that just didn't happen. It was a little vibration, and that was it. It was like a cello string at most. But that also meant that most of the people who were still awake, remember, this is basically it's 20 to midnight, it's 11:40 at night. Not very many people are awake at this time. This is 1912. When the sun goes down, people go to bed. So they're not, night owls like us nowadays. So the people who were awake, most of them didn't notice it. Thomas Andrews notices it because he's an experienced shipbuilder. He spent a lot of time out at sea, and he's just instinctively in tune to this. He's a natural engineer, and engineers are known, especially really good ones, are known to have just this intimate feeling of what they're sailing on and how it's handling. They just always just know. And Anders is definitely one of them. And you can see his reaction to this. He's thinking, he's got his head tilted. You can almost see the gears turning already in his head. Everyone else is curious, but they're not going to question it. It's the North Atlantic, stuff happens. Anders, however, knows this isn't normal, and when Dorothy Gibson here asks, what was that? He just shrugs and he says nothing, but you can see in his eyes the gears turning in his head, and he knows it's not nothing. He knows it's something, but he's not willing to frighten anybody unduly at this point by offering theories. He's just gonna continue on with his card game, but you can bet that he's got all of his senses focused on the ship at this point, on a conscious level. On a subconscious level, he's been doing it this whole time. But he's now really got his senses on alert, and he's paying attention to what's going on.
What was that?
Nothing. Sure.
And yep, see, there he goes. As soon as he can, he goes down below because he guessed that Titanic probably hit something. Based upon that vibration that they had, that jar, and it wasn't much up in first class, but his senses are telling him that something's not right, so his engineering instinct is to go down below and start checking the ship, and this is where he runs into the captain.
Well, scraped a long one. Murdoch ordered hard starboard and reversed engines, but it was very close.
So, the sound of the ship's engines, would they be that loud in first class? Probably. It sounds like more of a dull thud, just a little bit. Not quite that loud, but just this vibration, this hum. And for experienced passengers who spent a lot of time on ships, especially those who could afford crossings constantly, like Lord Manton here, who, just like most of the other gentry, this would have been no different than getting in your car today, let's say, and going to the grocery store or going to work. I mean, this is exactly kind of that same mindset. So these first class people would have been very experienced in, most of them at least would have been very experienced in crossing the ocean in liners, and so they would have been, on a subconscious level at least, attuned to the sound of the engines. They're not as good at picking up things as Andrews, because Andrews is trained. He's trained basically his whole life at this point on how to build ships, design ships, sail on ships. He knows more than these people do, but at the same time, for a first class passenger or even a second class passenger like Lawrence Beasley, for example, who I think this scene's supposed to be representing, they would have been aware that something was up as soon as they felt that the engines had stopped. And it might have taken a minute or two before their senses actually caught up to what their conscious brain was doing, but they would have eventually figured it out, those of them who were awake, and they would have started asking questions, which is exactly what happens here. So even though this is a fictional character, this idea is very accurate.
Louisa?
Why aren't you undressed?
Listen.
I can't hear anything.
Exactly. The engines have stopped.
See? And now you're hearing things outside, so there we go.
Officer, can you tell me what on earth is going on?
I'm very sorry to have to say it, my lord, but we've hit an iceberg.
What? When?
About half an hour ago.
But we can't be in any real danger. Not on this ship.
Get your women up on deck as quickly as you can. Make them wear something warm.
But surely, I mean... It's not going to sink.
I certainly hope not.
Quickly now, you need to get dressed.
So once again, this mindset of biggest ship in the world, she's invincible, she's unsinkable. So when he's talking about, we're not in really any real danger, not on this ship, that illustrates the mindset. Lightoller himself even said later in the inquiry that it wasn't until the bow actually dipped below the water surface that he thought she was actually going to sink. Like, he didn't realize or accept the idea that she was actually going to sink practically until the end.
They're getting the boats out. They say there's no danger. They're lying.
So once again, that engineering mindset, and this guy spent at least 3 years of his career working on this ship, and probably at least another 2 on top of that on Olympic as well. And so he, just like a lot of the other people, he knows the ship inside and out. And he would have been aware almost as soon as the steam started coming out of the funnels. And if I can play that scene, I will. But we'll see, just depending on what the copyright wants to do. And he basically is saying, I know more than what they're willing to admit. It's likely some of the crew didn't even know what was going on until they actually saw water coming in. So when he's saying they say there's no danger, they're lying. That just speaks to Maloney's intimate knowledge of this ship. And he almost certainly knew something was wrong as soon as the safety valves tripped on the ship. Titanic is powered by steam. She's going from full ahead to all stop. So it's not like you can immediately shut off that steam pressure. And that excess steam, it has to go somewhere. Steam is incredibly volatile. It has a nasty habit of expanding, also known as exploding, if it's not handled right, if it doesn't have somewhere to go. And steam explosions would sink ships. And there were reports from eyewitnesses who said that as Titanic actually went down, even though her boilers had been at idle until, for almost 3 hours, they still reported what sounded like steam explosions, as well as the last boilers in the stern rolling and tumbling down, because the boilers themselves are not actually secured to the deck. They're just held in place by their own weight. So as soon as the stern rose above a certain point out of the water, the boilers would have been free to tumble down however they wanted. And that might have possibly assisted in the breakup as well, because you got all that weight going down toward the center. Smashing through bulkheads, smashing through compartments. I mean, these boilers weigh multiple tons. They are extremely heavy. They're also still extremely hot. And likely, as soon as they came in contact with seawater, they would have exploded as well. So I think this is low. It sounds like it's fifth officer low.
Don't be a fool, Francatelli. This boat isn't sinking. That one is.
We don't have much time. Come along.
Good.
Well, there are no women here. So let some men get in. Cosmo?
Mr. Lightoller was very clear. Women and children only.
But if there aren't any...
So, couple things to unpack here. So firstly, Lightoller assumed that Smith was saying women and children only. Actually, it's women and children first, but Lightoller interpreted it the other way. Secondly, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, who's about to get in here, his wife, who we just saw a second ago, is Lady Duff Gordon. She is saying, come on, Cosmo. And, what if there aren't any more women? And Lowe here, I'm assuming it's Lowe, acquiesces basically at this point. And one thing I should point out about Jeff Gordon here is he gets a rep because he is often depicted as bribing the crew of their lifeboat with money in exchange for them not going back for survivors. And that's not actually the case. What actually happened was the crew were complaining about how the fact that once the ship had actually gone down, their pay stopped. They weren't being paid anymore, which is true. That's a law of the sea that carried on for a long, long time. So he's offering to compensate the crew, basically, from this point onward until they reach New York, which is actually very generous of him. So he's actually being generous, and then the press misinterprets his actions, and he's vilified for the rest of his life, and he spends the rest of his life defending his reputation to no avail.
The other way, this bar. Full. Stop!
What can we do?
We can't bring it back, I know.
So, quite a few of the first boats were lowered half full, and there's a couple reasons for this. One, because most of the people did not know what was going on, and I can't say I'm that surprised because the ratio of passengers to lifeboats was not that great. But it was within the law of the time. And most people didn't realize the ship was actually sinking. Captain Smith made it very clear that he didn't want the passengers to really know the full extent of what was going on. Andrews, always the greatest judge of people ever, went around telling different stories to different passengers, and he did that because he knew which passengers would keep a calm head and which ones would not. So the ones who would keep a calm head that he knew he would actually tell them what was actually going on, and that includes Lady Duff Gordon. Whereas some other passengers, he told them everything's going to be fine, even though that was a total lie, but he did that because he didn't want to ignite a panic, and that's exactly what Captain Smith as well wanted to avoid. So as a result, a lot of people stayed inside at this point. The safety valves on the Titanic are still going off. The funnels are still shooting out steam. It's noisy. It's cold. No one wants to be out on deck. So the first couple boats that go away really don't have that many people on them because of that. And Lord Matten here is angry about that, and rightfully so. I believe that the crew should have done more to, if not necessarily alert the passengers to what was going on, but to be more forceful in insisting they get on lifeboats. Trust me, the passengers would have thanked them for it later.
Back. Keep back. Let my wife and children through. Stand back.
Hey, what's that?
I said, stand back.
So, I'm going to have to address this. And this is something that it doesn't piss me off like the lifeboats do, but it is irritating. And that's the fact that third class people were deliberately held back. That isn't exactly true. There were some gates that were closed because they had already been closed and they had been just left that way, and there were others that were open. But there wasn't really a whole lot of organization on the part of the crew down there to direct people where to go. Most of the crew at that point who knew what was going on panicked and left. And third class were left to try and find their own way up. And again, some gates were closed, some gates were not. There's not a whole lot of evidence to suggest that the crew deliberately held them back. The evidence that's there is circumstantial and is often misinterpreted. I don't think that they did. But what did happen is that this is a big ship. There's a lot of hallways. Even the crew would get turned around. Lightoller himself said it took him about a week before he could confidently navigate himself from one end of the ship to another. And the passengers have even less experience on this ship. So in this winding, twisting, turning maze, with the lights probably starting to flicker at this point, it's going to be very difficult for you to find your way up with half the gates shut. So, while some third class passengers were actually able to make it, and about 30% of third class women actually did make it off. So, that does go against the trope that third class was somehow deliberately held back. That just doesn't add up. It was actually second class that suffered the worst. So Mr. Batley is going to be very, very lucky here because he's one of just 10% of second class men who survive. Meanwhile, in third class, if you don't know your way around, and other than the Maloneys, they don't, you're not going to really easily find your way through this twisting maze of hallways up to the boat deck in time to get on a boat. What did happen is a lot of third class passengers did find their way up to the boat deck, but by the time they did, all the boats had gone. And most of the people who were left on the ship, on the boat deck, on the stern, that the people in the lifeboats could hear screaming were third class. And it wasn't because they were deliberately held back by the crew, it's because they couldn't find their way up to the boat deck in time because no one in the crew was left down there to help guide them. They had all left. So I'm going to go ahead and go to episode 4 now. Episode 4 deals with just the 14th of April. It starts at around dinner time at about 6 o'clock in the evening on that one. And I'll just go ahead and just go through that directly. And we'll just continue on from there. So I'm going to end this one. I'll see you all in a little bit.